and welcome to Oakleaf Cakes, our tutorial videos. I'm Kathy, and today I'm going to be showing you how to do some super fun little Halloween cakes because Halloween is right around the corner. Smash! And I'm not knocking things off the table because that would be fun. So the three cakes I'm going to be showing you are super fun, they're super easy, and they're really cute. There'll be a mummy, a pumpkin, and a Frankenstein cake, all of which pretty much use the same tools, and obviously your ingredient will be cake. So this should be super fun. We'll launch right into it. So to start, I've got a whole bunch of stuff here on the table. Of course, I have some Italian meringue buttercream. Right below in this video, there'll be a link to one of our other tutorials on how to make that step by step, so check that out. But I have a whole big bowl here of white Italian meringue, and I also have a little bit of black Italian meringue right here. Just want to do a side note, if you are looking to add some color to your Italian meringue, we do recommend using gel dye. I have my bottle right here. This is the super black gel dye that I used to make this particular black frosting. And that just means that my buttercream won't water down the gel dyes, make sure it stays nice and stable, and I get a nice vibrant color, which will be important. A few other things out on the table. Let's see. Obviously, I have my cake. I have 3 layers of yellow cake here that we will use for the inside of our mummy. I have my turntable, which is one of the best accessories for cake decorating. It makes things super easy. I have my Halloween thematic little grippy thing. We'll put it in the center, which will secure my cake board. If you're just using a plate or basically any flat surface to put your cake on, you just want to make sure you have something that's going to help it stick to your turntable. So little silicone grip, a little bit of drawer liner, it's all good. Just a little bit of tape even, that'll work too. But keep your cake board in place. I have 2 piping bags. I'm going to need 2, one for black and one for white for our mummy. Let's see, our cake smoother, bench knife, dough divider, it goes by a bunch of different names, but basically if you have a flat straight edge, that's going to make things a lot easier. But if you don't have one of these, don't worry, you can probably do fine with a spatula. Speaking of, I have this lovely metal cake spatula and knife. We're going to be using that to spread all our frosting today. I also have this super epic cake knife. As you might see, it's basically just a bread knife, so if you do not have something that's called a cake knife at home, you just want a nice long knife with a serrated edge. The longer it is, the easier the cut, but just make sure you have that serrated edge. It's going to make your life a lot easier. So we have that. Optional tool number 2 is this little offset spatula. I'm going to be using that later on to just tweak my mummy's eyes. It's an optional tool, but I will show you how to, just whenever you're doing piping, how to smooth it out so you have a little more professional finished effect. So keep an eye out for that. Then in terms of frosting tips, I have 3 types of tips that I'm going to be using today. We have a rose tip. And you just want to make sure you have a nice long tip that has that tapered end, a little fatter on one side. This is a size 104 rose tip, so that is important. I have a size 11 round tip right here. And then I have a size 3 round tip. The sizes for the round tips, you know, if you're within a couple numbers, a 10 to a 12 for your bigger one, and somewhere between a 3 and a 5 for your smaller one. So just check your little numbers on the side at home and see what you have. And pretty much these 3 are all you're going to need for these tutorials. When we get to the Frankenstein cake in the 3rd video, there's one other extra tip that you might want to use, but we'll get to that later. So These three for right now are all you have to worry about. All right, so, oh, and last but not least, the coupler. This is one of my favorite cake decorating tools. I definitely recommend having several if you are going to be doing decorating. It makes changing colors so much easier. You just pop it in the bag and you can fill one bag with whatever color you're using and swap out your decorating tips so you don't end up with like 3 bags of blue and 4 bags of black just because you're doing a bunch of different tips for your design. So make sure you have a coupler on hand, one for each bag. So having 2 will be best for this video, and 2 bags, but you can also change out your frosting. It's a little bit longer, but it can be done. So we have all of our tools laid out. Oh, one other quick thing. Damp rag, always super helpful to have on hand. And also a little bowl for crumbs. We're going to be doing a brief crumb coat under our mummy. So this is just good to have on hand, so if you get any crumbs in your frosting, you can just scrape it in here and not in your buttercream. So we've run over all our supplies, and we're going to jump right in. So let's get to it. Yay! All right, so to start off, I have my 3 layers of cake, and I'm just going to want to real quick level each one of those so that that little dome on top is nice and flat. I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm going to take my cake knife and just get right down at eye level. Here's your squats for the day. And with just some nice even strokes, I'm just going to cut flat across the top. I don't need to cut a whole lot off. I'm just trying to get rid of that little dome. And that'll make sure that my cake layers are nice and even. And when I go to stack it, it just means that I'm going to have an easier time making sure that my cake is nice and level. So I'll just nice long strokes. And I want to make sure I'm doing some pretty even long sawing motions. If I just shove that cake knife right through, I'm going to end up squishing all my cake to the side and tearing it. So just make sure your strokes stay nice and even. And I'll just clear away those scraps. All right. So now that I have my 3 layers ready, I'm going to take my turntable here, and I've got my cake board on top. And to start, I'm just going to take my spatula here, and I'm just going to do a very little dab of frosting right in the center. You don't need to be too finicky about this. This is just going to help the first layer of cake stick on the board so it doesn't go sliding around as you're decorating. I'm going to take that first layer, make sure it's nice and centered on the middle of my board. And I'm now going to take my spoon and put what will probably seem like the biggest scoop of frosting in the center of this cake. Don't be afraid, we are going to need all that frosting. And no, it's not going to end up stuck in the middle of the layer, but we'll just get a nice big spoonful there. Because one of the things when you're decorating a cake to keep in mind is that it is always easy to take frosting away. But if you start with too little frosting and you're scraping it around trying to make sure it covers all your cake, it'll probably end up being a little too thin, you won't have enough frosting, and the biggest issue is it's probably going to pick up crumbs. And crumbs are such a challenge in the cake world, cake decorating. If it ends up in your outside frosting, it's not so great, it looks a little messier, so we're going to try and avoid that by putting on more frosting than we think we need and taking it away at the end. So I've got my frosting here in the middle, and I'm going to just start spreading it back and forth, just covering the middle of that cake with some nice even strokes. And once it's covered, I can't see the cake top anymore. Just going to give that a quick spin to level it out. I'll peek down to make sure it's looking flat. That's looking great. I'm ready to add my next layer. Now, my personal preference is I always like to flip the cut ends into the middle. It just sort of traps all the crumbs between them. But that's my choice. You don't have to do that. But, you know, it helps control the crumbs, so yay! All right, make sure that's nice and flat, it's nice and centered. We'll take another enormous scoop, boop, there we go. And I'll spread that out. So as you can see, as I've been spreading it, the frosting is being forced out to the sides, and that works out really well for me because that's going to make it a lot easier to cover the sides once I get back to that point, once I reach that point. So we'll spread that, give it a quick spin to level it off, and I'll add my top layer. Now, for this particular step, when you're adding your top layer of cake, if you have the layer that was pressed against the bottom of the pan, this is the side I cut, it has a lot of crumbs. This side was against the bottom of the pan, so it has a much crisper edge. And if you make sure that is facing up, it's going to be a lot easier to have a nice crisp edge to your cake. And having that nice cylinder shape is going to be a lot, more aesthetically pleasing and a little easier to frost. So keep an eye on that side. We call it the cake butt, little giggle. It's fun. So I'm just going to make sure that's facing up and put my top layer of cake on. Looks like it's nice and center. Looks like it's pretty flat. That's all good. All right, add my top bit of frosting. Give it a good scrape, and I'm just going to spread this out. I don't need quite as much for the top. All of this is going to be covered by the frosting wrap of our mummy. So if you are doing a different flavor on the inside, you can certainly do a different buttercream frosting. I would just be a little more careful then to make sure that when you're doing the wrap that we'll get to in a bit, that you are covering it up nice and cleanly with all that white. I don't know, maybe if you're doing like a green or a red, it'll look like, the mummy's peeking out from under his wrap. That could be kind of fun and creepy. But whatever frosting you're using, for this stage you don't need a whole lot on the outside. So I've got a pretty thin layer on the top. It's still covered, I can't really see my cake, but it's not quite as much as was between the layers. So now that that's covered, I'm not going to level it. I'm going to get back to that in a bit. I'm going to start covering my sides. Now this is a crumb coat, so I don't need to worry as much about adding on a ton of frosting here. I'm just going to pull some of this frosting around the side. And my favorite technique for covering the sides of a cake is actually to take the spatula in my hand and reach up and over this way. It's going to be a lot easier for me to make sure that the sides are level, because if I'm working over like this, it's a lot harder for me to actually make sure that I'm spreading it evenly. Seems a little counterintuitive, but once you get the hang of it, it's going to make for a much easier, much faster frosting process. So again, a little strange, but definitely worth it. So I'm going to reach up and over. And I'm just going to spread a little bit back and forth and just start spreading that extra frosting around. And this is where having that ton of frosting in the middle really helps me now, because I just have all that frosting on hand to cover the sides. I'm just spreading it all the way around. Can't see any more cake, so that looks like it's done. Just because that I was keeping my spatula pretty close to the cake just to be on the safe side. There might be some crumbs in this. I'm going to scrape it in this other bowl just to make sure that none of the crumbs get into my main frosting bowl. That way everything stays nice and clean and separated. So now that the sides are covered, I'm going to go back to the top and just use my spatula to level that flat. Tuck in the sides a bit. Now what you really want when you're covering a cake is to make sure this frosting kind of comes up on the sides in a peak, because if you have that extra frosting there, you're going to be able to sweep it into the middle later and get a very crisp corner. Maybe not as critical as with this particular design, because we're going to go back and cover it with ribbons of other frosting, but just as you're practicing cakes at home, if it's something you build into a habit, it's going to make things a lot easier later. So something to keep in mind. All right. Now that I got my sides and tops covered, I'm going to grab up my bench scraper, cake smoother. You can do this step with the flat of your metal spatula over here, but if you have this tool, it's a little easier to use. So I'm just going to grab that. I can also use it to scrape off the extra around the base, which I'm going to do. And then with this one, I'm going to line up my cake knife on the side, my cake smoother, bench scraper. I'll probably call it a bunch of different names in this video, but this tool, you know what I mean. Gonna hold it flat against the side of my cake. I'm gonna reach around with my other hand and I'm gonna turn this in one motion, which is gonna get me a very smooth, very even, I guess smooth frosting side? Yeah, we'll go with that. All right, so I'm gonna press it against the side of my cake and just give it a quick turn. And I pretty much instantly have this very smooth outer layer. I can just do it one or two more times to pick up the rest of the bubbling, but looks like I have a nice smooth cylinder. Again, if it's not a perfect smooth round, that's okay. I wouldn't worry about it. What you're really looking just is to have your sides pretty straight. We're gonna go back and cover it with ribbons, but the straighter and smoother you can get that cylinder, the easier your cake is gonna be in the end, or the easier it is to decorate your cake. But hey, it's a mummy, so if it's a little lumpy, you know, he's been hanging out in the desert a little longer, and that's okay. So my last step is I'm gonna take my cake knife again, and I'm just gonna sweep these little peaks into the middle to get a nice clean corner. And I'm trying not to sweep all the way over the cake. I don't wanna just pull them off the side. You see I got a little ambitious there and pushed that frosting over, but you can fix that, it's okay. I think I'll go in and just smooth that a little once more. So I have this nice cylinder, he's all frosted. The reason we call this a crumb coat is because you can still see the cake a little bit underneath, but that's okay. I don't want a ton of frosting right now because I'm about to add more frosting, and I don't know about you, but I do like a decent balance ratio of cake to frosting. We'll just clean this down. So now that we have our cake all crumb coated, we're gonna start doing the wrap on the mummy. So for this, I'm gonna be using my little rose nail tip, or rose tip. I don't know why I keep calling it a rose nail tip, but there is another tool called that, fun fact, but this is just a rose tip. And I have my piping bag with my coupler all down in it. So the first thing I'm gonna do is fill my piping bag. So I'm just gonna unfold the bag, take a scoop of my white buttercream. I'm just gonna scrape it across the top of the bag like this because I really wanna minimize the amount of air bubbles that end up in this frosting. So I just patted that first scoop in. I'm just gonna scrape this second one right on top, and that'll just pack the buttercream in on top of itself and minimize the amount of air that's stuck in the bag, which will make my piping a lot easier. So we have a good 3 scoops, should be enough to get around this cake, but will still be easy enough for me to squeeze. So just get that down, awesome. I'm gonna put my rose tip on top. I'm renaming it, it's just gonna be called a rose nail now. Can't do it, all right. So it's not super critical how you hold this tip. You'll get a similar effect, but I like to make sure that the skinnier part is facing down when I do this, because that means that the bandages are gonna flare out a little bit more, and I just think it's a slightly, I don't know, realistic is probably a bit of a stretch, but we'll pretend it's a more realistic look. So I'm gonna make sure I'm holding this tip straight up and down, and I'm gonna start at the bottom of the cake, right down here. I'm gonna try and squeeze in a continuous line and just start piping a ribbon all the way around this cake. Now we're gonna start at the bottom, squeeze, and as I'm squeezing, I'm gonna turn the turntable. Now, if you want, you can just keep doing stripes all the way up. That'll be great. But if you're feeling up to it, you can just keep squeezing, and as you do your ribbons, just start slowly spiraling up the cake. And what's really fun about this design, if your ribbons get a little wonky, that's okay. He's a mummy, he's wrapped, his wraps are kind of falling off as he's risen from the dead. You know what, it's all good. Own your wonky ribbons. And I'm just gonna keep spiraling all the way up the sides of this cake. Got a little ruffle there, that's fun. All right, now that I've reached the top edge, I'm gonna just scrape the extra buttercream off. And I just wanna check to make sure that there's no cake showing through there. And if there's a spot where maybe you have a gap, you can go back in and just pipe a little line to fill it in. Again, you don't have to be too worried about how neat this is. That's part of the fun of the design. Wonky ribbons make for a more personality-filled mummy. So now I'm going to do the top of this cake. I'm going to make sure I'm holding my bag flat, and I want this tip, the skinnier end, to be facing out toward the edge of the cake and away from the center. So I'm going to start out on the edge, and as I'm squeezing, I'm just basically spiraling into the center and making sure to overlap. And again, if you get a little squirrely with your ribbons here, totally fine. All right, there we go. So now that I have my ruffle cylinder, my mummy base, I'm going to just put that bag to the side. I'm going to hold on to this bag of white. I'm going to come back to it later. But the next step is going to be to add some eyes and a little happy mouth, or scary mouth, or whatever emotion you want your mummy to be feeling. So I'm going to go grab that black that I was using earlier. And for this, I want to have, I'm going to start with my larger round tip, the size 11 that I was using earlier. And I'm going to do some eyes, basically. So to start off, I'm going to find a spot on the mummy about, not quite halfway down. I'm just going to go in, and I'm going to pipe a slightly larger circle. Now, you can, if you want, just use the dot, but I like to make a slightly bigger circle. And then the fun extra tip is to grab that offset spatula, and you can just use it to give him a little curve to the bottom of his eyes. Or maybe you pipe the curve at the time, whatever brings you joy. All right, and then if you have sort of that, you can see it's not quite totally smooth, I can just use this offset spatula to just very gently smooth the eyes flat. I'm then going to grab my size 3 tip right here, and I'm going to switch out the tips on my black bag. See, this is where the coupler comes in handy. Didn't have to make 2 bags of black. I'm going to go in and add a little smiling mouth. Happy mummies. And you know what? We're just going to add little eyelashes because I'm extra like that. You don't have to add eyelashes. You can do whatever you want. You could add eyebrows or who knows what. I don't know. It's your mummy. And last thing, I'm going to use that same number 3 tip. I'm going to swap it out with the white, but I want to hold on to that rose tip. I'm going to need that again. And just to make the eyes pop a little bit, I'm just going to pipe a little dot of white right in the corner, sort of give my mummy some eye whites. All right. Once you have your face done, the last step is to add some remaining bandages. And this is sort of where you get to go crazy. I just like to make a few bandages that sort of swoop over the face and down around the cake. So let's see, we're gonna do one that's sort of draping off the top, hanging down, ooh, falling all over the place. Yeah, we sort of one hanging that way. And then, let's see, we'll do one coming off the side and draping over the face. Oh no, he just landed directly in front of his eyes. Alright, we'll just, fixing the cake. Alright, do some little drapey, proper drapey ones. Looks like he has a mustache. That's cool. More drapey bandages. Yay. Let's So you can just do some draping bandages, sort of all over the place. He's losing a lot of wrap. There we go. There we go. All right. Our mummy has lots of unraveling bandages. He's got a happy smile, and he is ready to go. So that is our finished mummy design. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you're looking for our Italian meringue buttercream recipe that we used in this video, it's going to be linked right below. Otherwise, please stay tuned. We have 2 more awesome designs coming up to add to your cute Halloween cake collection. So, did you like that alliteration? I did too. Anyways, I hope you tune in for the next 2. We're going to have a lot of fun, and we will get some more spooky friends going.